We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Cuba and Venezuela are in the crosshairs of the new Trump administration. At stake is the sovereignty, freedom, independence, and self-determination, not only for the people of Cuba and the people of Venezuela, but for all of Latin America. Welcome back to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Manolo De Los Santos. He is the Executive Director of the People's Forum. Manolo, welcome back.
Good to be back with you, Brian.
Well, Joe Biden, almost at the end of his administration, took Cuba finally off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. Completely political act to put it on and to take it off. But Donald Trump coming into office says, well, Cuba's back on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Anyway, they're gunning for Cuba. Trump is gunning for Cuba. We know this, but they're also gunning for Venezuela. Anyway, let's start with the state sponsor of terrorism list.
Well, it's a completely arbitrary list. We've talked about it on this show before. It's a list that basically is up to the political feelings of whoever is in term of administration at that moment. Cuba was taken off that list in 2015 by President Obama. Trump put Cuba on that list days before he left office in 2021. And to everyone's surprise, Biden kept it on the list. A list, again, for which there was no evidence process. There was no fact-based process to determine whether Cuba was or wasn't. But everyone in the world knows. In fact, even State Department officials that I've talked with have confirmed many times over, there is no proof to say that Cuba is a terrorist state or that it sponsors terrorism in other countries. There's overwhelming proof to the contrary. You know, Cuba is in fact an exporter of peace, of healthcare, of education around the world. It's a well-known fact.
Let's just talk for the audience. What's the significance of being on the state sponsor of terrorism list? Again, this is a U.S. created list. It's a U.S. government list. HTS, the group in Syria that just took power in a U.S. supported military operation, they were on the state sponsor of terrorism list, but they're coming off of it. Obviously a political designation, but what's the implication for Cuba?
Well, the most immediate impact of being on the state sponsors of terrorism list is that no banks around the world are willing to manage your transactions.
So Cuba can't do business.
Cuba is not allowed to do business. And it very concretely means that when Cuba, for example, wants to buy a shipment of food in any country around the world, even if that country is willing to sell Cuba this food, what bank is actually willing to actually process this transaction? And banks have a very simple reason. If they were to process these transactions, they would come under the full scrutiny, huge investigations by the US government. It's a sort of extraterritorial sort of policing of US law that ultimately implicates every country in the world, every financial institution in the world.
So if Canada, which has long-standing economic relations with Cuba, or a European country, even countries that are allies of the United States, but disagree with the United States, at least in some part on the blockade of Cuba, if they want to do financial transactions, if they want to do business, if they want to sell Cuba agricultural products, they too could then be sanctioned or punished under the state sponsor of terrorism designation.
Not just punishments, but they are hefty punishments. I mean, there are banks, there are other financial institutions that have had to pay millions of dollars to the US government, essentially for doing a simple transaction that ultimately all go to fulfill Cuba's basic needs. I mean, it's the ability of Cuba to, buy oil, to buy food, to buy medicine. And the other implications of this list, and I think it goes particularly to the question of Cuba's energy sector, which has suffered so much in the last years, is that it doesn't allow Cuba to actually renew its electrical grid. All the basic pieces needed to renew Cuba's electrical grid are basically being prohibited under this state sponsors of terrorism list.
So immediately, it's the Cuban people who are suffering from this. It's the Cuban people.
On the daily, Cuban families actually have to bear the brunt with the long and extended blackouts, with the scarcity of food and medicine, with the severe limitations to their daily lives. the U.S. government often will say, they're trying to corner in the Cuban regime or the Cuban dictatorship. But what is a Cuban regime at the end of the day if not the Cuban people who have made a choice to live in their country? Is that their crime?
I mean, Cuba is in the Caribbean. It's very warm in the summer without
The long summer.
Long summer, a very long summer. And then, of course, the hurricanes. But the absence of electricity is sort of a central strategic thrust by imperialism to weaken Cuba or to weaken the credibility of the Cuban government with its own people. I mean, this is like, we're going to make your people suffer so that eventually they'll cry uncle, eventually they'll rise up, eventually there will be a regime change. But in the meantime, and for many, many years, decades, in fact, Cubans suffer.
I mean, I think we're living now, Cubans are specifically living now, probably the closest realization of what Lester Mallory would have hoped for when he wrote that memo in 1960, that infamous memo, where they said the objectives of the blockade was precisely to inflict so much harm on the Cuban people directly that they would be the ones in turn to rise up against the Cuban government and overturn it in favor of U.S. interest.
Well, go ahead. You were going to finish.
No, I was just going to add that right now, concretely, when we say blackout, what that means really in Cuba is that children cannot go to school if the schools do not have electricity. Factories have to close, which means workers cannot produce the necessary goods to keep the country going. It means, seriously, the most severe disruption of people's lives on a daily basis.
All right, I want to keep on this theme a little bit longer, but not immediately. We'll come back to it because Henry Kissinger back in 1972, 73, when he was Secretary of State, said about the sanctions being imposed on Chile at the time, because Chile had a socialist government. It didn't come about because of an armed struggle. It came about because it won in an election, but the U.S. didn't want it. The U.S. wanted to topple it. So Henry Kissinger said, we're going to make the economy scream. Now, these are sort of euphemistic words. You're actually talking about we're going to make working class people, poor people, even middle class people scream because we're not going to let them lead the lives that they would normally expect to lead because of an economic policy imposed by a very powerful country that dominates the world economy against a weaker country. Poor countries never get to impose sanctions on rich countries. It's a one-way street.
Always. And countries like Cuba, but not just Cuba, but at this point, a third of the countries of the world basically have to live under the threat of U.S. sanctions constantly. The threat that at any point, any sovereign decision that you make as a country can be interpreted as what the U.S. considers a declaration of war against their interest. In the cases of Chile, because they refused to hand over their copper. But in the cases of Cuba, simply because Cuba doesn't have the natural resources that many other countries have. In fact, it doesn't have much per se that the U.S. wants, but it does represent more than any other type of threat, the threat of an example.
Okay, let's stay with that. I keep saying we're going to go on to something else and then diverging, but Cuba plays a very outsized role in world politics. It's a small country. It's an island, and yet Cuba has always loomed large in world politics.
It punches above its weight.
Way above its weight, way above its weight. And when you think about the fact that the world almost came to the brink of nuclear annihilation in October 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba was at the center of that. The year before that, right after the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. invaded Cuba. It was a U.S. invasion. It was called the Bay of Pigs. It used Cuban mercenaries, but it was a CIA operation. Again, a very, very outsized role. And Fidel Castro, I mean, if you went to Africa, if you went to the Middle East, if you went to Asia, it didn't matter where you went. If you were going somewhere with Fidel Castro, like masses of people wanted to come out, see him, touch him, be in his proximity. And again, this outsized role, what accounts for it?
Well, there could be many factors to explain Cuba's large role in world politics. But I would say the primary reason is that Cuba made a decision early on after 1959 that it wanted to stand with the people of the world. It wanted to do something to change the reality of millions upon millions of people in the world. That's why it started sending out teachers and doctors everywhere it could. Not as a way to impose a Cuban line of thinking, which it hasn't, not because it wanted resources, natural resources from other countries in exchange, but because the Cubans genuinely believe to this day that saving the lives of children in the Congo betters the lives of Cuban children. Mm. It's hard to reason in our own society where there's no reason why we would want to help other countries if we're not getting something in exchange. So this Cuban model of, I wouldn't say helping others, but being there for others, standing there with others in need, has ultimately changed the equation, because many of these countries now begin to see Cuba as a model of defiance, as a model of an alternative society, as a model of what they would want to become if the U.S. weren't placing so many restrictions on their own sovereignty.
So it's purely political. I mean, in terms of U.S. animus, it's not because Cuba has great natural resources like the copper in Chile. It's not because it's a huge country with a geostrategic sort of landmass that borders an important trade route. This is politics.
I mean, the reality is that there's nothing really for the U.S. to steal in Cuba, like it would in Venezuela or in other countries around the world. But the fact that Cuba continues to maintain an independent foreign policy, that on all the core issues of our time, Cuba stands diametrically opposed to U.S. interest, has provided a sense of threat to the U.S. government.
In one way, because it's an inspiration to people who want to overcome oppression and exploitation. But then at other times, like after September 11th, when the U.S. was attacked, Cuba was right there offering cooperation with the United States in anti-terrorism activity. I mean, there is this obviously two different worldviews. The Cubans are socialists. They're about internationalism. They're about solidarity. They're against imperialism. The imperialists are on the opposite side. But the Cubans are also, and have shown that they are completely willing to cooperate wherever sort of the olive branch has been extended.
Well, I always like to point back to a curious but heartbreaking story. Because when we talk about terrorism in the Americas or around the world, very few people know that the first time an airliner, an airplane, was attacked, fell, exploded because of a bomb placed on it, was a Cuban airliner in 1976 that killed about 80 young people who were coming from a sports tournament in Venezuela. Who were the culprits? U.S.-sponsored and financed terrorists who not just committed this heinous act, but committed committed thousands of other attacks against the Cuban people.
And this is not rhetoric. I mean, this is actually a known fact that it was the CIA-sponsored counter-revolutionaries who blew up a plane in mid-flight, a civilian plane.
And this is not just facts for the Cuban people. These are facts established in international law at this point. I mean, at different points, there were requests for extradition of these terrorists from the United States because of the weight of these crimes. So Cuba has always been committed to anti-terrorism. The fact has been, though, that every time Cuba has essentially put its hand out and said, we want to cooperate with the U.S., we want to negotiate, we want to, in fact, settle our differences. At some point, Fidel even says to Lyndon Johnson, there are differences that are unnatural and unnecessary. The Cubans have always been disposed to cooperation with the U.S., but without ever having to surrender their sovereignty, their political independence, without ever having to bring to the negotiation table the status of their political economic system. I mean, no one would come to the U.S. government and say, in order for us to have sovereign relations, respectful diplomatic relations with you, we expect the United States to change its form of government. And that is what the U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. laws, basically demand every time there's a conversation with the Cubans.
You know, it's so interesting because the U.S. and Vietnam were at war, and Vietnam is led by a communist party. 58,000 Americans were killed. Hundreds of thousands were wounded. Millions of Vietnamese were killed, of course, before the U.S. was defeated. But the U.S. has a good relationship with the government in Vietnam.
Good relationship would be too polite of a way to describe it. It has a strategic partnership
Yeah,
with
they
Vietnam.
recently announced strategic partnership with Vietnam. So it's a communist-led country. Quote, one-party state, as the U.S. would describe it. The U.S. had very good relations with the People's Republic of China until the U.S. had the pivot to Asia, and then relations have deteriorated. But my point is that having a communist-led government doesn't mean that the U.S. can't have and hasn't had normal relations with that government. Now, I think, and I'll get your opinion on this, then we're going to come to Obama, the point that I want to really get to. I think that unlike Vietnam or unlike China, the American government, the American imperialist government, looks at Latin America as its backyard. That hasn't changed. This is like from the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. feels like, Cuba, Puerto Rico, none of these countries really should be free. This is our backyard. We're going to dominate. And so the U.S. had the Batista dictatorship, and everybody recognized it was a dictatorship, a brutal one. It's overthrown by a multi-political tendency, multi-class revolution, the July 26th revolution, and many other groups too, but July 26th movement led by Fidel. And immediately the U.S. goes to war against the new Cuban revolution. I mean, Fidel came to Wall Street, took off his military fatigues, put on a suit, came to Wall Street, said he wanted to do business with the U.S. And the whole time the CIA was like, okay, how can we assassinate him? Which they tried like 600 times. Again, it wasn't at that point about socialism or communism because the Cuban government didn't say it was socialist until later. It was like Cuba was going to be free. And I think the U.S. was thinking, oh, that means the Venezuelans will think we can be free, and Brazil and Guatemala and Peru. It's our backyard. I think that's the real dynamic here.
And that mentality has not changed in over 200 years. The idea that not just Latin America is our backyard, but that Latin America is a direct property of the United States. That decisions cannot be made independently in the Latin American region without, now I wouldn't say consultation, without the approval of the United States government and its economic interests in the region. I mean, Cuba in particular, though, I would say more than any other territory in Latin America, the U.S. ruling elites, going back to Monroe, to Thomas Jefferson, have always felt a particular closeness, or the idea that Cuba, beyond any other part of the region, particularly belonged to the United States.
They wanted to make it a state. I mean, there was a debate about whether Cuba should be a state.
And it was the ripe fruit that they were simply waiting for it to mature and drop into the hands of the United States. But the Cuban independence movement got in its way. In fact, you could say the War of 1898, what the U.S. calls the Spanish-American War, was an attempt to try to circumvent the growing demands for independence by the Cuban people and to claim claim for the United States the territory of the Cuban people.
So the U.S. said in 1898, and this is important, and again, most people in the United States, sadly, because we learn our history from American textbooks, will think that the U.S. went into Cuba in 1898 to free the Cuban people from Spanish colonialism. Same with Puerto Rico. Same with the Philippines. All of that happened in that same war. But of course, the Cubans never felt that they were being liberated by Americans. If they could have, and Spain surrendered actually before the U.S. invaded.
In all three countries, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, Spanish colonialism was already on its knees and ready to surrender to the forces of independence in those three countries.
Donald Trump says they're going to take Panama back unless Panama gets on its knees right now. But that's at the same time. If we look at this period, 1898, and by the way, Trump's new favorite president appears to be Theodore Roosevelt, who led the charge into Cuba in 1898. But you have the U.S. took Puerto Rico, it took Cuba, it took the Philippines, 1 million Filipinos died. But that was part of an effort by imperialism, by U.S. imperialism, as it became a global empire. They wanted the northeastern industrial heartland, and that's what it was at that time, to be able to send products to Asia. And the better way to do it would be to come through Central America. So there was the stage-managed independence of Panama from Colombia, the conquering of Panama, the building of the canal, and the U.S. had Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. This was how the U.S. it was its first pivot to Asia. It was the first pivot to Asia, was the seizure of this territory. And here we are, Manolo, 2025, and Donald Trump says, we're going to take Panama back. Panama doesn't have that right. I mean, of course, Panama was invaded in 1989. But let's just talk about this. Again, keep with the framing. This is Latin America's independence. That's what's actually at stake.
And to add to that, I would say that originally the Caribbean has had an important geostrategic value. I mean, the reason for claiming Puerto Rico and Cuba is also to defend the United States' entry into the Panama Canal. From Puerto Rico and Cuba, historically, the U.S. projected its power into the region. Its warships, its planes, its capacity to invade and to occupy and to control the territories of Latin America depended on its maintenance of Cuba and Puerto Rico as permanent bases of its military power. So that's very important for us to remember. The fact that Cuba broke with that challenged the U.S.'s ability to dominate the region.
And the U.S. is still in Cuba. The U.S. is in Cuba. The U.S. has a
Illegally.
military base in Cuba.
Illegally.
Guantanamo, the only place in Cuba where people are tortured.
Exactly.
Like, it's an amazing story. I want to talk also about Venezuela. We
were supposed to go forward when we went deeper into history.
We keep going. We're going this way and that way, but that's okay. I want to get to Venezuela soon, but let's go back to 2015. I was at what had been the Cuban intersection and became the Cuban embassy in July 2015. That was an initiative of President Barack Obama. His vice president was Joe Biden. Now, there was a great sense of euphoria about this. The embassies between Cuba and the U.S. have been closed for 54 years. Obama said at the time the reason he was going to open the embassy is that the old policy didn't work, meaning Cuba wasn't becoming isolated at that time. It was the U.S. that was becoming isolated. Cuba and Venezuela had forged an alliance, along with Bolivia, along with Ecuador, along with other countries that were not maybe as left, but moving in a leftist direction. So Obama said, like, the old policy is hurting us and helping Cuba, helping the revolutionary flame. So they opened the relations. They opened the embassies in both countries. And Obama actually went to Cuba, and the Cubans allowed him to speak on national TV. I mean, the Americans didn't say to Raul, please come and speak on CNN to the American people, but the Cubans actually made a very significant concession, but they were doing it in the hopes of having a better, quote, normal relationship with the United States. And here we are 10 years later. Biden didn't go back and reverse what Trump did. He stuck with the Trump policy.
I mean, I remember 2015. I actually remember, like if it were yesterday, the day, December 17th, 2014, when we heard the announcement from both Obama and President Raul Castro of Cuba saying that there was the door that was being opened towards normalization of relations between both countries. And it was momentous. It was incredible. It was almost impossible to believe because despite the fact that the Cubans, since 1960, have consistently, administration after administration, opened the door for negotiations, have sent messages of willingness to talk and cooperate with the United States, those olive branches were either rebuffed or ignored. And it was this particular context in 2014, 2015 that allowed finally for a break in this all-out direct confrontation between the United States and Cuba. It was the consensus of the Latin American countries, both of the right-wing governments and the left-wing governments, who came to Obama and said, this policy is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. But it was more importantly the fact that the Cubans never gave up on their willingness to talk. In fact, surprising to many Americans, in Cuba, there has never been an anti-American sentiment. People were often surprised when, the rush came to visit Cuba in 2015 after Obama lifted the travel ban. hundreds of thousands of people from the United States visited Cuba for the first time and saw it with their own eyes and realized, wow, these people don't hate us. The Cubans love people from the U.S. They love to engage with American culture. But most importantly, this country is not a threat. This country has no desire to attack the United States. They don't present any, terrorist threats towards the security of the United States. That, I think, changed the minds overall of millions of people in the United States who began to see Cuba similar to what many Americans thought of Cuba in the 1940s and 50s. Wow, the nice, warm, holiday-perfect country to the south of the United States, where there was no question of why we would not want to have relations with it.
Highly educated population, healthcare is free, as you mentioned, an excellent climate.
And most importantly, a safe country.
A safe country. Like the first time I went to Cuba was in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, and that was after the Soviet Union fell. That was during the special period. There was a lot of economic hardship. But I felt very, very safe no matter what time, day or night, we were on the street. And that was when the economic contraction after the fall of the socialist bloc was very severe, like maybe 30% drop in the overall economy.
More,
okay. Again, and I don't know, but a huge economic contraction. So you would think more poverty, that would mean more crime. But I can tell you, I felt absolutely safe in 1994 walking up the streets of Cuba. Again, these kind of advantages that Cuba had would make one think that a normal policy would be, let's have a normal policy. Let's treat Cuba as a normal country. Let's have normalization of relations instead of treating Cuba as a Cold War adversary. And again, there is no socialist bloc. So it really has to be something else. It's not like Cuba is exporting socialism everywhere around the world. Cuba is trying to live. I mean, the slogan of the Cuba Solidarity movement now really is let Cuba live. It's not about something else. It's that basic. But the U.S., I think, feels that Cuba was on the ropes, that the economic suffering had become so deep and so intense that maybe ultimately the opposition would be able to be developed a U.S.-sponsored opposition such that there could be regime change. Now, the Cubans are absolutely determined to hang on to the revolution. And the Cuban people, in spite of all of the economic suffering, basically want to be free, independent people. And they've had many decades, many generations now of people who know what it means to be independent and free. So that's not going to happen. But Trump's effort to put Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list should be considered, I think, by people, progressive people, whether you're a socialist, not socialist. If you believe in justice at all, if you have an ounce of humanity in you, you should treat this as a crime against humanity. People in the United States have to say no to the Trump administration on this.
Well, there was that common sense moment in 2015. Common sense, you should have normal relations with your neighbors. You should have good relations with your neighbors. And, the Obama administration really tried to advance, to a certain extent, a series of areas of cooperation. I mean, the Cubans at this point were even sharing with the United States treatments for cancer vaccines. I mean, it was an advantageous relationship for both countries. But comes Trump in 2017, and immediately, in the early months of the Trump administration, excuses, fake news, malicious stories start to come out.
The Havana Syndrome.
The so-called Havana Syndrome. And I always say so-called because to this day, no U.S. government institution has been able to provide resolute information or facts to demonstrate that the syndrome ever even existed.
And I think the U.S. government now says that there was no foreign adversary that did something to this embassy or other embassies that created the syndrome of symptoms where people had a hard time hearing or whatever. But basically what Trump did was he drained the U.S. embassy. They basically took their diplomats out of Cuba.
They turned a case of mass hysteria, which is, in my opinion, what really occurred, into the excuse essentially to begin slowly breaking down the advances of normalization between both countries.
What Obama had done.
So from not just draining embassy staff, but the most immediate impact of retiring embassy staff was to begin to end the visa application process between both countries. There had been an agreement put in place under the Obama administration that Cuba would be able to apply to a certain number of visas every year. Visas that include everything from being able to do cultural and sports exchanges to family reunification. There are over 1 million Cubans living in the United States who want to be able to bring their families to live with them here. And they have that legal right like every other immigrant in the U.S. has. Now, these measures, one by one, begin to tighten the noose around Cuba. Because they went from not just draining embassy staff, but eventually to adding over 243 sanctions on Cuba. Sanctions that went from...
Additional
sanctions on top of over 5 decades of U.S. sanctions and blockade against Cuba. But these sanctions put in place by the Trump administration really, I would say, have been probably the most surgical of the sanctions against Cuba. Because they particularly target, for example, Cuba's ability to import fuel. They sanctioned the ships that Cuba used to import fuel. They sanctioned Cuba's state-owned company and privately or mixed-owned ownership companies that Cuba used to buy this fuel in other countries. They then went after the companies that purchased Cuba's renovation of its electrical grid. And we started to hear stories, for example, of foreign ships bringing to Cuba supplies to renew its electrical grid that were stopped in mid-sea because they were informed by the U.S. government that if they were to hand those over to Cuba, they would be implicated in breaking U.S. embargo laws. And the Trump administration used the funniest excuse for all of this. Cuba has tens of thousands of soldiers propping up the dictatorship in Venezuela. Who were these so-called tens of thousands of soldiers? They were the Cuban doctors and teachers working in the poorest neighborhoods of Venezuela, providing free healthcare and education to people. That was the excuse. They really hoped in those periods between 2019 and 2021 that if Cuba would break its relationship with Venezuela, if it would end its cooperation with Venezuela, it could break the back of the Venezuelan political process. It could overthrow President Maduro. Both things failed, but in exchange, the Cubans were left with not just these sanctions, but they're added back in the last days of Trump's administration to the state sponsors of terrorism list. They're under all these onerous laws. At some point, even remittances to Cuba were outlawed. Imagine that. Millions of Cubans, immigrants in the United States, were not able to send money to their relatives. It was sort of the recipe for a perfect storm. The perfect storm that would ultimately create the crisis that Cuba is living right now, where people have to struggle not 1 or 2 times harder, 100 times harder to make ends meet. And who do the Cuban people have to blame for it? Well, the U.S. government tells them every day that it's the fault of the Cuban Revolution, that it's that socialism cannot provide for their basic needs. And it hides constantly the hands of the U.S. blockade, as if it somehow never existed to begin with.
All right, let's turn to Venezuela. So Trump had Cuba in the crosshairs. Life got worse, not just a little bit worse, a lot worse. And then Biden continued it. We'll come back to that. Biden continued Trump's policy. Didn't go back to Obama's policy. He continued Trump's policy. I mean, if people wonder, why did the Democrats lose? Why do they keep losing? Why have they lost twice now to Donald Trump? Why is the brand of the Democratic Party so, people think of it as such garbage? Well, it's because the Democrats under Biden or Harris look like the Republicans, except a slightly, mildly lighter version. That's not inspiring if you believe in justice. Anyway, Biden continued this criminal anti-people policy when he came in. Now, Trump in 2019 announced that Nicolas Maduro was no longer president of Venezuela. and that in fact Juan Guaido, this was in January 2019, Juan Guaido was the president of Venezuela. Like most Venezuelans at that time had never heard of Juan Guaido. Again, this sort of brazen cowboy Yankee imperialist effort to smash the revolution, it looked like, like Venezuela and Cuba, they could not possibly endure because there was the January announcement by Guaido. Then the U.S. seized Venezuelans' assets, including its embassy in Washington, D.C. The British took $1 billion in gold from Venezuela. Then there was an armed effort at the Colombian border. That was in February. Then I think it was April 30th, 2019, another openly U.S.-supported military uprising, which also failed. But it looked like there's no possible way Venezuela could survive, but Venezuela did. But again, I think the past is prologue here, because what we could see by Trump, what Trump did to Cuba and Venezuela, that's kind of what's coming. And I think progressive people have to be aware of it and know that if the Cubans are ready to fight to keep their revolution, if the Venezuelans are ready to fight to keep their process, their revolution, people in the United States, the place where all of these problems really originate, people in the United States have an obligation, moral, ethical, political obligation to say no to Trump on this. But anyway, let's talk about Venezuela.
No, I think it's kind of has a similar timeline. I mean, Obama had in 2014 declared that Venezuela was an extraordinary national security threat to the United States. But it isn't really until 2017, when the Trump administration comes in, that sort of whatever plans had been in place to overthrow the Venezuelan government got like an extra push. All of a sudden, we're starting to see measures, specific sanctions being made to target Venezuela's oil industry. I mean, this is taking consideration that oil prices had been going down already, but the U.S. government particularly wanted to destroy Venezuela's oil industry, thinking that that would be enough by shrinking its GDP by 3/4, almost 80%.
That's what happened.
Yes. It would be enough to destroy Venezuela's economy and therefore topple the Venezuelan government. I mean, I think I heard President Maduro say just recently, imagine a country that goes from $56 billion in revenue one year to $700 million a year.
No, I mean,
the human cost of that.
That's crazy.
The human cost of that, estimated by experts in the United States, actually points out that it caused the death of over 100,000 people due to lack of medicine, immense scarcity. The economy went to tatters. Hyperinflation, you name it. But the U.S. realizes that it wasn't enough to destroy Venezuela's oil industry. It would have to go further. And it created this figure that no one knew of in Venezuela beforehand.
Juan
Guaido, who I would say now has become sort of the reference for, if you want to see what a clownish politician looks like, you will see Juan Guaido's photo there.
Counter-revolutions that go off the track.
Yes.
Juan Guaido.
U.S. major failures, classic example. But they bring in this guy who no one knows in Venezuela, no one knows abroad, and say that he is the president of Venezuela. And they create this situation where countries, basically, the U.S. forces the rest of the world to have to decide, do you recognize Venezuela's president or do you recognize our president of Venezuela? And I always find interesting that quote. Both Mark Esper and John Bolton said that Trump said it, that Venezuela is really part of us. It's really our territory. That's how they've always understood.
Mm-hmm.
But the Juan Guaido experiment failed miserably because at the end of the day, he didn't represent anything, even to the opposition figures within Venezuela. But what was next? The U.S. at some point was threatening military invasion. And there's plenty of proof of it because there were, in fact, multiple U.S.-sponsored, U.S.-financed mercenary attempts to introduce military violence into the country. And all of them were caught and arrested by the Venezuelan military. I mean, it was like how they go from the Bay of Pigs fiasco in the 1960s to the Bay of Piglets fiasco in the 21st century. It's really embarrassing for the United States because ultimately every attempt they have made to overthrow the Venezuelan government has backfired, primarily because the U.S. fails to realize that at the end of the day, the majority of the people in Venezuela, whether they support the government or not, do not want to see their country overrun by the U.S. Mm. They don't want to see their country have to basically give up the world's largest oil reserves and the world's fourth largest gas reserves and an amazing array of rare minerals over to the U.S. to control. That is ultimately the line for most people in the country. And the fact that the Venezuelan government, despite this onslaught, despite this loss of GDP, despite the hyperinflation, despite the economic crisis, has, at the end of the day, learned to provide for its people. When we look at the numbers, comparing 2017 in Venezuela to 2024 in Venezuela right now, it's an economic miracle.
The economy has improved.
How do you explain that a country that for 100 years, because of the oil industry, basically imported 80% of its food to now a country that produces over 90% of its food? In a sense, U.S. sanctions backfired in Venezuela. It's one of those rare examples of a country that is fully, slapped with all these U.S. sanctions and somehow comes out better in the end.
I saw a recent statistic that said that in the recent period, there's been economic growth, not just stabilization, but growth, I think at a 6% rate. I mean, that's very significant.
Well, the rate for 2023 was 5.5. And the estimates for 2024 are as high as 9%. I mean, it's really incredible considering that even in countries with a relatively, similar sized economy like Colombia, for example, their growth rate for 2024 is probably between 1.8 and 2.4. That is outstanding. And it speaks ultimately to Venezuela's political economic model. A model where people have the right to make decisions, where people's livelihoods and well-being are prioritized by the government, even when they're being slapped with sanctions.
What's your assessment of the danger, given the fact that the U.S. failed in the case of Venezuela with economic sanctions and regime change and color revolutions, of a direct U.S. Military intervention in Venezuela? I mean, the U.S. invaded Cuba in 1961. That was the Bay of Pigs. Invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965. Invaded Grenada in 1983. I'm not talking about where the U.S. used proxies and military dictatorships. I'm talking about direct military intervention. U.S. invaded Panama in 1989. And afterwards, the U.S. dissolved the Panamanian military because Torrijos and Noriega and the people who had been sort of in opposition to the white Panamanian ruling class proxies of imperialism, they had tried to have some degree of independence and take the Panama Canal back under the sovereignty of Panama. So they were targeted. So I'm just wondering, given the failure of the U.S. with these other measures in Venezuela, do you think, or do the Venezuelans think that the U.S. might be contemplating military action?
Well, I think there's two factors or two lines of thinking that help explain why the threat of military invasion is plausible and real in this moment under a second Trump administration. One is that Trump already said he was interested in invading Venezuela. In his first administration, he was already talking about how, in fact, it would be cool to finally invade Venezuela. So there's an interest there.
That's Trump. That's cool to invade.
Yeah, let's why not? But there's a second factor, which is that ultimately the playbook of the CIA, of U.S. regime change, used by both Trump and Biden administrations, have ultimately failed. What's left for them to do? They tried to buy out Venezuelan generals. That never worked. They tried to destroy Venezuela's electrical grid. That didn't work. They tried to create not just Guaidó, but they tried now to create a second Guaidó, Edmundo González.
Who the U.S. says is the new president of Venezuela.
Who the U.S. says, but at this point, not even the European Union is willing to go along with this fanciful story that the U.S. has presented. That hasn't worked. They tried to induce hyperinflation in Venezuela, and the Venezuelans brought hyperinflation down. They tried to run many types of candidates approved by the United States. They failed. What's left in the U.S. playbook? At this point, many Venezuelans think that what the U.S. has left is a military invasion, very likely to a Panama style of what happened in 1989. But the threats, the stakes are higher for the Venezuelan people because, again, beyond where you stand on the political spectrum in Venezuela. I mean, I've talked with opposition lawmakers in Venezuela from the historic opposition parties in the country.
And they're against Maduro.
Yeah, they're against Maduro. They run their own candidates. They're not in favor of socialism. You could almost say they're anti-communist. But they believe in the rule of law. They believe in fighting for Venezuelan democracy on their own terms inside their own country, not from abroad like Edmundo Gonzalez, who wants to defend Venezuelan democracy by calling for military intervention. No, these are different types of folks. And, talking to them, I've heard them say multiple times over, a U.S. invasion would leave us like what? Libya? Iraq? Syria? Either as a cemetery or as a madhouse? In no way would a military intervention by the U.S. actually solve the problems of Venezuela. The problems of Venezuela have to be solved by Venezuelans themselves on their own terms without foreign intervention. Again, it's a common sense position, but it seems like common sense is lacking not just in Washington, but specifically in the Trump White House.
Well, Trump says he's going to have a common sense revolution. And by that, they're firing all the black and brown people in the federal government because they say, we want to make sure that, common sense dictates that people are hired because of merit, not because of who they are. And I'm thinking like, oh, that's Donald Trump, who by the time he was 8, had like $5 million from his dad. Like a bit of an advantage for the capitalists or all the South African capitalists like Elon Musk or Sachs or, Peter Thiel, Paul Ferber, all of these racist. I don't know. Are they fascist? I don't know. Elon Musk, I mean, he looked like a Hitler, a Sieg Heil salute to me, and he seems to love all of the racist South African government, but...
Well, I don't know if everyone in the Trump administration is a fascist.
No, they're not all fascists.
But there are certain Nazi-saluting billionaires who do have a clear agenda. And it's to, as quickly as possible and as much as possible, fill their pockets with the monies of the American people.
And you could see, just take that. When they look at Venezuela, they think, oh, there's the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. Cuba, I mean, under like their control and free of sanctions and embargo. If Cuba was allowed to live, Cuba would be a thriving country.
It could be a powerhouse in the Caribbean. Imagine a country, again, that has one of the most literate populations in the world, extremely highly educated. I mean, in their dreams, in their wildest dreams, these billionaires often think that if they could free Cuba, liberate Cuba from the evil dictatorship on the island, it could become their little Singapore in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
But we know very well from looking at Puerto Rico, which they also thought was going to be their Singapore in the Caribbean, what it actually means for the Puerto Rican people.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Trump is on the right wing. Trump's billionaires, some of them are fascist. New York Times is not fascist. New York Times is the liberal bourgeoisie. But they had an article recently on their opinion page by Bret Stephens. He's a regular columnist. But the Times obviously wants him to be writing these articles. Otherwise, they wouldn't let him. They're not asking you, Manolo, for an op-ed. Here it is. The headline. The headline is Depose Maduro. Okay, that's dramatic. New York Times, not the fascists, the liberal bourgeoisie. Donald Trump has set some grandiose foreign policy goals for his second term, from buying Greenland to ending the war in Ukraine, quote, in a day, close quote. Here's one goal that is long overdue, morally right, and in our national security interest: deposing the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela through coercive diplomacy if possible, or force if necessary. Yeah, they're calling for a military invasion of Venezuela. That's actually on the agenda. And it's not Fox News. This is the New York Times.
And, for me, the most appalling part of that opinion piece was not just that it was in the New York Times. As you said, the clarion newspaper of the liberal bourgeoisie in the United States. But that it talks of morality, and this idea that the U.S. has some divine right to not just police the world, but to intervene and do as it wishes in its backyard. Who gave the U.S. this right? The people of Latin America have never consented over the centuries to the U.S.'s divine right over any of us. Nobody in Venezuela has consented to the U.S.'s divine right. So why was the liberal bourgeoisie, which considers itself enlightened, rationalist, modern, and progressive in the 21st century, imposing the divine right of kings over the rest of the people of the world? It should be something that, when that article came out, it should have been condemned by every common sense liberal in the United States. But sadly, the reality is that it was in fact applauded by many. Because what's at stake for them is, how can they increase the coffers of their own interests in the United States? The deaths of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans is simply collateral damage. Sadly, it couldn't be avoided, they would say. But in the end, it was worth it because the U.S. gets the oil and the Venezuelans get to keep whatever they call democracy.
Yeah. And again, Manolo, if it was 100 years ago when the U.S. invaded Haiti, like 110 years ago in 1915, or invaded Puerto Rico and kept reinvading these countries, setting up military dictatorships that were trained by the Pentagon, trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. I mean, the worst dictatorships in the world were set up under the aegis of the Pentagon, and then after 1947, the Pentagon and the CIA in Latin America. They didn't care at all about the lives of people, nor did they, like in the case of the invasion of Haiti, when the U.S. went in and the Marines went right into Port-au-Prince and took all the money out of the bank and brought it to New York City, they didn't say at that time, oh, this is for the good of the Haitian people. They were like, no, we took it because we could. But today, it's always a noble cause. It's always something moral and ethical. In fact, it's the same colonial system, but now dressed up with noble-sounding phrases. Underlying all of this is sort of an absolutely predatory sort of relationship by the United States and Latin America. And again, this is the framing that I think for all of the progressive people who want to do something is most important. Is Cuba socialist? Yes. Is it led by a communist party? Yes. Is Venezuela want to have a socialist society, the Venezuelan government? Yes, they do. No question about it. And as a socialist, I think that's a good thing. But there's even a bigger framing to this, which is, does Latin America have the right to determine its own destiny? Does Panama have the right to control Panama? Does Venezuela have the right to control its country? The people of Haiti? Like, this is actually what's at stake right now. And you can see that all of the noble-sounding phraseology is just camouflage for the predatory nature of imperialism.
I mean, all that Latin Americans ask for is resumed in what you said. All we ask is that our sovereignty, the independence of the peoples of Latin America, be respected. The peoples of Latin America are not interested in imposing a form of government on the people of the United States. They just ask that no form of government be imposed on them. In fact, across the political spectrum in Latin America, and it's reflected in the declarations of the community, the Latin American Community of States, CELAC, which clearly point out, we will defend the right to a diversity of forms of government in our region. No other country in the world does what the US does, which is that in order to have normal relations, in order to have common sense relations, they have to impose a form of government. And you would have thought that that would have been a thing of the past, of the 20th century. Many Americans will say that imperialism is over. No, imperialism is alive and well. It's often hidden. It's often washed away with all these fancy terms. It's not talked about in the major media, but the reality exists and persists. And for as long as the US continues to want to impose its will, like Trump is doing now in regards to Cuba and to Venezuela, which is my way or we will kill you with more sanctions and blockades. For as long as that continues to happen, people will continue to resist. People will continue to fight. I mean, nowhere in the world yesterday did I hear anyone in Cuba or Venezuela say, okay, Trump, we will quit, we will surrender, we will submit to your rule, we will agree with you because you've put us back on the terrorist sponsors list. No one in the world would submit to the U.S. on those terms.
One of the big issues in the United States domestically right now is immigration. So we had a lot of people from Venezuela leave 2019, 2020, 2021. Many of them went all over the place, but a lot of them came here. A lot of Cubans left. It's normal that if a society is being essentially destroyed economically, that parts of the population are going to try to leave in order to just feed their families. They're not leaving because they're diehard opponents of Nicolas Maduro, whatever. I mean, some may be, but the bulk of the people just want to be able to live. I mean, most people are motivated by that. And now you had a lot of Venezuelans coming to the United States because of the policies of Trump, but continued by Biden. Same with the Cubans. And then Trump turns around and says, look, all of these Venezuelans are coming and taking over our cities. And now we're not, and it's Biden's fault because he has an open border policy. And again, the whole framing of the debate was such that the Democrats, as typically they do, started backing up and saying, yeah, we agree with Trump. We have to get stronger at the border. We have to make sure that asylum seekers, millions of whom have a legitimate claim, will not even be processed. And in the same time, allowing the right wing to use immigrants as a punching bag. So now Trump has come into office and they're going to carry out mass deportations of people who have come to the United States, not because they, quote, love America, but because they could not live in their own countries. I mean, it's worse in Venezuela and Cuba because they're being targeted. But wherever there's poverty, wherever there's unemployment, and neoliberal capitalist policies have accelerated all of these trends, all of these class divisions, all of this inequality. People are going to come. Again, for the working class movement in the U.S., the socialist movement, the progressive movement, we have to stand with the immigrant families because they're working class folks like everybody else, but at the same time expose that the reason people left their homeland is because of the imperialist policies designed to crush independence in Latin America.
I mean, President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico, in one of her most recent calls with President Trump, said it. If you want to stop the growing migration of people coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, and sanctions, and the blockade on Cuba and Venezuela. When you look at the moment in which the peaks of migration from both Cuba and Venezuela start, it is directly related to the strengthening of the sanctions on both countries. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans start coming when? 2020, 2021, with the impact of the measures imposed by Trump. Same thing with the Venezuelans. So if the U.S. now wants to deal with the immigration question, deporting people is not the easiest answer because people will keep coming.
Yeah, people will come back.
People will always come back. Because while the conditions back home continue to be the same, there is no reason for people not to come back. And it's going to be hard when you have people like Marco Rubio, who are now Secretary of State, who think they can have it both ways. They think they can crush Cuba even further and at the same time prevent Cubans from coming over. They'll have to make a choice. If they really want to deal with this immigration crisis, the solution is clear. And it's not me and Brian in New York, two socialists, saying it. No. You have lawmakers actually on both sides of the party, both Democrats and Republicans, saying this. You have think tank experts in Washington, D.C. who affirm this. You have political leaders across the region who have made this clear. So it's really on Trump's hands to determine which way they're going to go.
All right. As we move to the end, I want to talk about what people in the United States should do. I feel that Trump coming back, Trump has he has the bit in his mouth. He's very aggressive right now. He feels like he's got this mandate. The Democrats have been crushed. He has no internal opposition. The rest of the factions of the capitalist ruling class are basically kissing his butt. So he's feeling very, very empowered. And if they could take down Cuba or take down Venezuela or whatever, Trump only thinks about this as a feather in his cap. And he was like, look, I did for imperialism what Biden couldn't do, what Obama couldn't do, what Bush couldn't do, what Carter couldn't do, what Clinton couldn't do, what Nixon couldn't do. So he's going for it. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I think we have to build a very broad movement right now in solidarity with Cuba. I think that this sort of first days and weeks of the Trump administration, where he's feeling this kind of megalomaniacal empowerment, this is going to start to fade quickly. We have to build a mass movement. And I think there's a lot of people in the United States who are not socialists, who are not, quote, anti-imperialists, but people who believe in justice, who don't want Cubans to starve, to not have electricity. We have to reach a broader part of the population and bring them in and let them understand that this is one of the moral, ethical, political dividing points of the modern era, is standing with Cuba and with Venezuela. And I think as we do it, the people of Latin America are also going to stand. Like all of these attacks against Panama, they can't but inflame an anti-Yankee colonial feeling in Latin America. Again, what we're experiencing in the first days and hours of Trump, this will change, but what we do will make a difference. Anyway, you get the last word.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to call on common sense Americans to defeat fear-mongering and saber-rattling. It's really on the American people. Again, not just the socialists, but the millions of American people who don't want blood shed in their name. It's their position, is their coming out into the streets, is them mobilizing and calling for the U.S. to respect Latin America, but more importantly, to not engage in war with the people of Cuba and Venezuela. That will make the difference. It will save the day. The people of Latin America are going to fight. Like you said, the moment Trump started talking about Panama, it united the Panamanian people across the political spectrum in the country. The same has happened across the rest of Latin America. Will the people of the United States, the common sense people of the United States, unite with them to prevent war, to prevent destruction, and to stand for the most basic of things that we do share, which is a sense of justice, a sense that no country should have to bow to another. We wouldn't have accepted it in the past. We shouldn't have to accept it now.
All right. We'll leave it right there, Manolo. We're just getting started with this campaign against Trump's policies towards Cuba and Venezuela, but stay tuned, everybody, because we have to do this, and I think we can really build a new mass movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you.